Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us again on another one of our Safer at Home series talks. Glad to have you with us tonight. Before we get started, a couple of things. As you know, these talks are brought to you by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. All books in this series are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller. If you would, make sure that you mute yourself, and if you've got questions, or use the chat feature down below, and we'll do that at the end. Our speaker, Stephen Johnson, is author of 12 books. He also has, he's a host of PBS's How We Got to Now, and he's got a podcast, American Innovations. His latest book is one called Enemy of All Mankind, and I don't know about you, but I'm a sucker when it uses the word pirates. So when I read about that this was available, I was thrilled when he said yes. So would you welcome Stephen Johnson, who, by the way, told me he was worried he was going to have to do this from a Holiday Inn, and no, he's doing this from home. So I'm very glad that he's comfortable at home. So would you welcome our guest tonight, Stephen Johnson?
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Mark. I'm delighted to virtually be here. I've spent a lot of time in the coastal New England region in Cape Cod and particularly in Martha's Vineyard. So I wish I were in person. We were somewhere at the museum or in a bookstore there, but this will have to do for now. And perhaps on a future book tour, we can all meet up in person. I do want to give a little bit of the backstory, since I think you would find this interesting, of why I thought I was going to be in a Holiday Inn. And to just tell you a little bit about what my day has been like, and then we'll dive into the book story, which is my next book is coming out in May, and it's the story of how we doubled global life expectancy over the past 100 years. It's a book called Extra Life. It's a kind of a big sweeping story with lots of different narratives about the triumph of extending life, all written in the context of the current pandemic. And we are also making a PBS series based on it. And it is similar in style to my PBS series, How We Got to Now, if any of you had a chance to see that, tales of innovation and progress and the collaborative networks that make it possible. But we're at the very end of shooting this series, which is coming out, in 2.5 months or whenever it is exactly. So it's all very last minute. And I have a wonderful co-host of that series, which is the British historian David Olashogo. And if any of you saw Civilizations on PBS, he was one of the co-hosts of that with Simon Schama and Mary Beard. And we've been trying to shoot these sequences for the show where we get together and have a conversation face-to-face about all the issues that the history raises. And COVID has just prevented it because he's in London and I'm in New York. And so we ultimately decided that we would shoot these conversations with high-end cameras on both sides, but basically over Zoom. And so I've just literally spent the entire day, 8 hours, basically on an extended kind of high-tech Zoom call, talking about my next book. And now here we are on another Zoom call talking about my last book. And so all of which is just to say that if I seem confused or if I pass out in the middle of this, or if I start rambling about some other book, that's the excuse. And please just, Mark, intervene and tell me that I've lost the thread here. But anyway, I'm delighted to get this chance to talk to you and delighted to revisit Enemy, which came out last year. Just a word about how I got to this book. It is fundamentally a story about a pirate, but it's a lot more than that as well. Years and years ago, I had written a book called The Ghost Map. It came out in 2006. And The Ghost Map was the story of the British doctor and epidemiologist John Snow, who solved the really pressing mystery in the middle of the 19th century of what was causing cholera, one of the great killers of 19th century society. And Snow figured out that it was in the water supply, not in the air as everyone believed. And in the middle of a terrifying epidemic, he kind of did this extraordinary investigation. So it's in a sense a kind of detective story in a way. But it's a story about a moment that really changed the world, in some ways a story about the kind of the birth of the modern world in this medical breakthrough that snow makes. And that book, unlike a lot of my other books, really does follow a single storyline and a single kind of set of characters in London in the 1850s. And in the books that I've written since then, they have been more kind of driven by ideas, or they've had multiple, you know, they tell dozens of stories from different periods. This new book, Extra Life, about life expectancy, is like that. But I always really enjoyed, just as a writer, writing a book with some kind of single narrative thread running through it from history. And what I like to do in my books is take that narrative and then kind of branch off in different directions and explore all the interesting forces that are at work at that particular moment in time, whether they're economic forces or intellectual forces or political forces or technological forces. But when you have that single narrative, you know, it keeps the reader going for obvious reasons. And you know, there's a reason we all like stories. And so 5 or 6 years ago, I was, having written a bunch of other books in kind of other modes, I was like, I want to get back to that ghost map mode. There was something about that structure that was really compelling. And I started to think that if there was a crime at some point in history that connected to a lot of themes that I've found interesting just intellectually, or a historical period that I knew something about that I could kind of dive into and explore, that there was a built-in structure, kind of a page-turner structure to that crime narrative, where someone commits some dastardly deed and the authorities are after them and they have to track them down, and there's some resolution. That I thought maybe that would be a great architecture for building you know, another book in the mode of Ghost Map. And so then I did this kind of strange backwards search, and from the very beginning, I had this idea that I wanted to write a book where the opening scene would be just a very short snippet of time, you know, 10 minutes or an hour at some point in history. And the idea would be that you would say, there in these 10 minutes, something transformative happened. And then you would go back and hear the whole prehistory of those 10 minutes. And then at the second half of the book, you would go forwards and find out the consequences of those 10 minutes. And that was, I had, in a sense, kind of the architecture of the book that I wanted to write in my head, but I didn't actually have the material or the subject matter or the actual facts. And so I spent many years, actually, just kind of waiting around with that idea in the background in my mind as I worked on different other projects and wrote other books, waiting for a story that I might kind of stumble across that would fit that model that I had in my head. And at some point, I think about 4 years ago, I stumbled across a story of Henry Avery. We don't really know how his name is pronounced. Is the pirate at the center of this story. And I kind of dug around into his history, and the more I dug, the more I realized that this was the story that I really had to write, that this was the story that was that finally fit that mode that I'd had, that vision that I'd had for so long in my head. Now, unlike a lot of my books, this book really is kind of a thriller in some ways, and so I'm going to try and balance the the desire to tell you some of what happened, but also to leave some of it ambiguous, so that hopefully you'll get a chance to read the book. But let me set the stage a little bit about the period. So the events of this book take place at the end of the 1600s, really starts 1693 and ends around 1697 or so. And it's a very interesting moment in the evolution of the kind of the world system of trade and commerce. So what you have in the middle of the 1690s, at that point, India is actually probably the wealthiest country in the world, and just in terms of overall wealth. It's not very well distributed. There's a lot of inequality, but they have a vast amount of basically of capital and jewels. And India at that point is run by the last of the Grand Moguls, the last of that Muslim dynasty Aurangzeb, who's maybe the most notorious of the Grand Moguls. And Aurangzeb is a religious zealot who is also almost certainly the wealthiest person in the world, just has this kind of vast fortune. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have England, which has been increasingly involved in global trade. And for the last 70 years or so, there has been an institution developing in England that is central to the kind of cutting edge of economics and commerce, which is the East India Company. And the East India Company is really a model of what is coming in terms of the future of capitalism, right? It's the first, in a sense, publicly traded company in history where you have kind of openly publicly traded shares. And one of the first cases in which people start to make money, not just from the commerce and the profits from a given enterprise, but from buying and selling the shares in the company, which turns out to be the way in which most of the richest people in the world today now make their money. And so one of the ways in which you can think about the overarching kind of context of Enemy of All Mankind is that there are these two ways of accumulating a fortune. One of them is very old, and that's Aurangzeb, dynastic wealth, passed down through, generations of rulers and monarchs and kings, money extracted through taxes and tithes and things like that. And that, at that point, is the dominant way. If you want to become wealthy, that's the dominant way of making money. On the other end of that spectrum is the East India Company. And this is a glimpse of the new regime that is coming to the world. And in the future, the richest people in the world will make their money through publicly traded companies, private corporations, not through ruling over vast empires. In between those two forces, these two giant global capital accumulating forces, is a pirate named Henry Avery. And he ends up getting caught up in a web of conflict between Aurangzeb and the East India Company. And so in a sense, you kind of have three models of how to make money. Form a joint stock publicly traded company, become a Grand Mogul of India, and the third way is become a pirate and try and steal a little bit from both of them. So Avery gets into this situation where he is hired as the first mate of he's kind of a veteran seaman. We don't know very much about him. He's kind of a mystery up until this point. He's probably, we think, in his late 30s. And in 1693, he signs up as the first mate on an expedition called the Spanish Shipping Expedition, or Spanish Expedition Shipping. And it's 4 ships that have been chartered to go to the West Indies to trade with the Spanish and maybe to do some kind of diving to see if they can recover some gold and valuables from sunken ships in the Caribbean, effectively. And the flagship of this small little fleet is a brand new ship called the Charles II. And crucially, the story, this ship is kind of state of the art. It's incredibly fast on the water. It's just a beautiful new vessel. Avery takes off as the first mate of the Charles, and they get hung up in a harbor in Spain, waiting for paperwork to come from Madrid to authorize them trading with the Spanish in some fashion. It's a little bit unclear what really happened in terms of this. And they end up sitting there months after months waiting for this kind of bureaucratic snafu to get resolved. And there's some conflict where the men on board the ships aren't getting paid properly because, of course, this voyage hasn't really started in earnest. And their wives back in London, who were supposed to be getting regular checks for their work on board this voyage, aren't getting the checks, and it's just kind of a crisis. And so eventually, Avery begins to plot a mutiny, and he kind of slowly rallies a number of people on board various of these ships and convinces them to abscond with the Charles II. And so there's a very kind of dramatic scene, which we know quite a bit about because of future events, the details of which. So it was very fun to get to write this kind of sequence about the mutiny. But basically, he takes off with a bunch of people, allegedly offers the existing captain a deal where he can join them as well if they share some responsibilities, but the captain turns him down. And so Avery absconds with the Charles II and heads off with this idea of becoming a pirate. And they almost immediately rename the ship from Charles II to the Fancy, which is a wonderful name. Fancy, I think, as in the vision, the dream, and also perhaps a sense of we're going to be very fancy once we accumulate all the wealth that we're going to accumulate on this trip. There's an obvious thing for this kind of newly rechristened pirate ship to do at that point, which would be to sail, to follow the trade winds to the Caribbean and begin to perform the acts of piracy that are kind of now legendary and from the golden age of pirates that followed in the early 1700s in the Caribbean. But Avery has a much bolder plan in mind. And when you think about it, given the limitations in terms of navigation technology of the day, it's quite amazing that he was able to pull it off. He decides and convinces his crew that what they really need to do is to travel all the way around the Horn of Africa, briefly stop over in Madagascar, which of course was a kind of a pirate's den at that point, to provision and work on the ship a little bit, and then sail to the mouth of the Red Sea. And this was an incredibly important part of the world for pirates. In fact, today, even to this day, the most notorious pirates of modern times, the Somali Pirates, basically do their business in the same waters. Now, of course, it's because giant oil cruisers are coming down from the Middle East. But in 1694, 1695, when all this is happening, the real value of positioning yourself there at the mouth of the Red Sea was that there would be ships coming back to India, having made the pilgrimage to Mecca. They would have these beautiful, vast treasure fleets that were filled with immense amounts of gold and silver and ivory and all the wealth of that period. And they would make these pilgrimages to Mecca. And they, along the way, they would stop over and do a lot of trade. And so they were extremely rich targets. And so the idea was if you could get in the right position when they were returning from Mecca, it would be kind of basically hunting season. You'd be able to capture an immense amount of value in a very condensed amount of space. And so whenever he actually shows up with the crew of the Fancy, in this zone, it turns out there are kind of 5 or 6 other ships there, including a very famous New England pirate named Thomas Tew, who's from Rhode Island. Some of you may know the story of Thomas Tew. And Tew had actually just the year before, 2 years before, pulled off a heist in exactly that area and had decided, he made an immense fortune from that, but had decided to come back and try his luck a second time. Interestingly, in this scene, the various kind of clans decide to form kind of a mini armada together. And while Tew has all this experience, Henry Every ends up getting elected the kind of the leader of the extended pirate family, which tells you something about whatever faculties he had. There was some kind of charisma to Every. We don't really know that much about him as an individual. He for a brief period of time was the most notorious criminal in the world, and then he kind of disappears for reasons I'll leave a little bit mysterious, so I don't give away everything. But he ends up kind of leading this mission, and it turns out that Aurangzeb has sent a massive ship, arguably maybe the largest ship in the world at this point, the name of which was anglicized as the Gunsway. And it was this huge vessel, and on board, unusually for this period, on board the Gunsway were a number of religious pilgrims who were women, who were making their kind of one pilgrimage to Mecca for the Hajj, some of which were in the extended royal family of Aurangzeb himself. And there was a rumor, almost certainly not exactly true, that one of the women on board the ship was Aurangzeb's granddaughter. And I spent a lot of time in researching the book trying to figure out if there was any way that that was literally true, that it was a kind of direct descendant. And it seems like, from what we know about Aurangzeb's family, it seems like the chronology doesn't quite match up, that it would make sense. But that was the kind of myth that developed around this story. But regardless, there were a number of people in the inner circle, a number of women in the inner circle of Aurangzeb that were on board that ship. And at some point in early September of 1695, Every's much smaller ship, the Fancy, encounters the Gunsway in the Indian Ocean. I think it's September 11th, 1695. And this is the moment where, this is the fulcrum moment where kind of in the space of 10 minutes, a very short series of events happen that send shockwaves around the world. In fact, the book begins with this scene, and then you go backwards and try and understand what led up to this moment, and then you go forwards in time. And in this moment, basically, Every should be massively overpowered. There's 4 times as much firepower and cannons on board the Gunsway. There are way more men. There's practically an entire army on board that ship, and he should be radically overpowered. He does have the faster boat, that's for certain. But in terms of the firepower, it's not a close call at all. And there's some question about why Every would have even challenged the Gunsway. Was he really that reckless? Because it seemed like a losing battle from the very beginning. But 2 things happen in the space of just a few minutes that are incredibly improbable in terms of them happening right next to each other. First, one of the first cannonballs that Every fires from the deck of the Fancy ends up hitting exactly squarely on the mainmast of the Gunsway and disables it. So the whole rigging kind of comes collapsing down. And so the ability to just control the Gunsway in the water is heavily compromised. And right at that point, one of the cannons on board the Gunsway explodes. We don't know why. It may have been some kind of malfunction in terms of the way that it was engineered, or maybe operator error of some kind, but it blows up. And as I'm sure many of you know, a cannon that explodes, if it's not maintained properly, it becomes basically a bomb. And so instantly, multiple members of the crew on the top deck of the Gunsway are almost atomized. There's this terrible explosion. A dozen or so people are killed over time. The deck catches on fire. There's complete chaos. And so the combination in just these few minutes of the mainmast strike and this cannon exploding gives Avery the advantage his men need. They storm the ship. And what follows is both a heist of historic proportion. That no one really knows how much money in today's currency, how much treasure in today's currency they sold. It could sometimes valued as much as $200, $300 million. It's generally considered to be one of the largest heists in the history of crime. So there's vast, almost dynastic wealth that his men take off of that ship. But alongside that, the men discover that their ship is filled with women, with these religious pilgrims, and they're incredibly savage sexual attacks on these religious pilgrims. A number of them actually commit suicide to avoid being deflowered, in the language of the day, which is to say raped by the pirates. And there's a scene of just kind of terrible sexual violence and carnage. What happens in that mix to Aurangzeb's direct relatives is one of the great mysteries of this story, and there are really two tellings of it. In the legend that developed around Every, and this is almost certainly apocryphal, this almost certainly did not happen the way the legend has it. The story goes that Aurangzeb's granddaughter is brought to Every on board the Fancy, and improbably the two fall in love and are married by a Muslim cleric, and they retire to a pirate kingdom that Every builds for himself on Madagascar, and they live happily ever after, this kind of multicultural fairy tale of these two people, the up from his bootstraps British pirate and the Muslim princess. That is the legend that spreads around the crimes of Henry Every back in England. And it's told in the kind of burgeoning magazine and newspaper business, which is just getting started, which is a huge part of the history of pirates, that their stories, their exploits were sold on the streets. There were these wonderful early media of the ballad mongers, which were people who would sing out the news of the day and sell people basically kind of prose poems describing the exploits of pirates. And so all through the streets of London, you would hear in the months that followed the story of brave, bold Henry Avery, who stole a ship and married a Muslim princess and made a fortune for himself. And so he became a kind of working class hero back in England in an age where there really was not a lot of social mobility, right? There weren't a lot of stories. There were no Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerbergs in that period. There weren't people who had come from nothing who, assembled a vast fortune through their own daring do, right? The pirates were the early rendition of that kind of heroic rags to riches story. And so basically Avery was celebrated and revered for this extraordinary crime that he pulled off. But there was a problem, right? And the problem was twofold. It was Aurangzeb, who quickly got word that one, his ship and his wealth had been stolen and attacked, and two, that members of his inner circle had been sexually violated or had killed themselves in order to avoid being sexually violated by these pirates. And of course, this is right at the moment at which the East India Company is making an absolute fortune exporting or importing from India these beautiful fabrics of calico and chintz that had captivated the upper class of Europe, particularly in the salons and drawing rooms of London. These Indian fabrics that were so beautiful and soft because they were cotton, and the way that they were dyed, you could wash them multiple times and they would retain their beautiful colors. And this was one of the great initial early kind of breakaway consumer hits in the global marketplace. And so the East India Company was absolutely dependent for its existence on a reliable trade with India. This was a central part of their whole prospects. And so here you have this like early stage version of what is going to become the future of capitalism, a publicly traded company, a multinational publicly traded company, dependent on getting these exotic fabrics from India into the drawing rooms and boudoirs of well-to-do European and British women and families. And Aurangzeb hears that this British pirate has run off with potentially his granddaughter and stolen his goods. And so he threatens to eject the East India Company from India. He threatens to just kick them out. He goes to a number of what they called factories, which were really kind of they weren't technically factories, they were more like their kind of local headquarters, and puts all the British people working for the East India Company under effectively house arrest, threatens to have them formally arrested, threatens to have some of them executed, because he thinks they're all in cahoots with this Henry Every figure, even though technically Every had nothing to do with the East India Company. And essentially this global crisis emerges because you have the most valuable new company in England about to go out of business and maybe have some of its major figures arrested and put to death in India, all because of this rogue pirate. And so it triggers what is really the very first global manhunt in the history of the world. I mean, it's really much like the story of Osama bin Laden many centuries later. The East India Company goes back to the British Crown and says, we need to find this pirate and we need to bring him to justice, because if we don't do this, we're going to be out of business. Like, we literally, all the British elite who've invested in the East India Company are going to lose their money because their shares are going to be worthless. And you know, this is an essential, this is an urgent quest for England, is to find Henry Every and to bring him to justice. And it's also an important moment because up until that point, if any of you know something of this history, the British government and the British Crown had a very blurry attitude towards the ethics of being a pirate, right? There was this difference between being a privateer and being a pirate. And you had people like Sir Francis Drake, who was, for all intents and purposes, a functioning pirate who did lots of terrible things around the world, but returned to England and was properly knighted and was treated as a legitimate member of society. And what emerged out of the Avery case, which is, multiple decades after Drake, is this realization that if we really are, as a country, if England as a country is going to participate in a new global economic system, and if we are going to make our money and have our society organized around these international trading companies, then we really need to finally take a stand opposing piracy in a serious way. We can't treat it with this kind of blurry, slightly hypocritical attitude that we've taken to date. We have to really crack down on it, and we need to make a show of that new position by finding Henry Avery and bringing him to justice. And so then all of a sudden, in this world that just a few centuries before wouldn't have been capable of anything like this, right? Because it just wasn't interconnected enough. All of a sudden, in this world now, there are missives being sent out to all the different branches that England has a kind of foothold in the world, saying, we are looking for this one man and his crew. And, here's the reward if you bring him to justice, dead or alive. And Avery realizes, he must have realized that the second he recognizes who he has attacked and just how much loot he's extracted from this ship, he must have realized that he was going to be the world's most wanted man at that point as well. And so the question was, could he escape the long arm of the law? Could he carve out a space for himself in the world with this fortune that he made for himself in the Indian Ocean in September of 1695, or was it inevitable that he was going to be brought to justice? I don't want to say too much more about what happens, and there is still some mystery about what ultimately happened. But one of the things that was so rewarding about writing this book is that without giving away too much, there is a trial at the end, which is really in many ways a show trial to demonstrate to the world that England has changed its tune on piracy and is taking it now very seriously. And because the British Crown wanted to make that statement to the world, really to an audience of one, to Aurangzeb, so that Aurangzeb would not evict the East India Company from the shores of India, they hired someone to take a very detailed, to compile a very detailed transcript of the trial and to publish it so that all the world would see. And as it turns out, for complicated reasons, which is part of the story, there are actually two trials. One doesn't go very well. The other one turns out a little bit better for the British. And they publish that transcript And in it, they interview, as both witnesses and defendants, a number of the pirates on board the Fancy. And so there are these extensive descriptions in the exact words of the pirates, describing both the mutiny, various events that happen along the way, which is part of the book as well, and the stopover in Madagascar, a few other contretemps they have with people along the way, the actual attack on the Gunsway. All of the events are described in great detail in this trial transcript. And as part of the research for the book, I ended up finding it as a PDF file that has been scanned in, that is literally actually kind of searchable. It's, I don't know how many pages, it's 40 or 50 pages of all this kind of transcript. And so as an author, this was an amazing discovery for me, because it meant that there are all these scenes in the book that I'm able to, first off, I'm able to quote directly from the participants and their words and things that were said in the middle of the mutiny. There's dialogue in the mutiny, there's dialogue and a bunch of other things that normally you would, the only way you could get that kind of dialogue is to invent it, which is kind of cheesy, and you wouldn't really do in a serious history book unless you were doing kind of a novelized version of it. But here you have all these events that took place in 1694, 1695, 1696, where I'm actually able in the book to really create a kind of a cinematic scene where people are talking to each other using the language that they actually used in the middle of the ocean in September of 1695. So that's one of those moments as a writer where you realize, oh, there's this incredible document here. And there are a number of other kind of interrogations of the witnesses before the trial actually started that we also have transcripts of. So it was a very rich trove of information to have in getting to write the story. So that is the arc, kind of a little bit more than halfway through the story. The last thing I'll just say is that I heard, after the book came out, I heard from someone wrote in to say that they had read the book and they had enjoyed it, and they had been researching pirate activity in New England and Rhode Island, in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and he had uncovered some coins that were Arabian coins that seemed to have been minted right around the time that the attack on the Gunsway had happened. And he found them in coastal Rhode Island, kind of near Newport. And he had developed a theory, which is pretty interesting and seems kind of compelling, that perhaps, we know that some of Avery's men did go to New England. And his theory was that, quite a bit of them had gone there, and that maybe Avery had stopped over there on his way to, we think he went to Ireland, but that's part of the mystery. And so he was writing to kind of find out if I had a theory about, Avery showing up in Rhode Island. And I said, well, that sounds very plausible. I hadn't seen any literature on that. But the thing that I really wanted to hear him say is, it turns out that my wife's family, on her father's side, is an old Rhode Island family, the Robinsons and the Rodmans of Rhode Island. And so what I wanted this guy to tell me is that Henry Avery had in fact disappeared into Rhode Island society, changed his name to Robinson, and here it was, 3 centuries later, and I was unwittingly raising his great-great-great-great-grandkids. But I don't believe that was the case. There's no evidence that my wife's family was related to any pirates. But it was a fascinating thing. So the story is still evolving, and perhaps we'll find more evidence of Henry Avery's path, perhaps through New England, as well as some of the other places that we know that he went to for sure.
Thank you, Stephen. That was awesome. And for someone who's just spent 8 hours talking about his upcoming book, you did an amazing job of focusing on this one. It was all good. Now, I love the fact that you actually had your plan in place as to how to write a book? I find you need a 10-minute snippet, an hour snippet, and everything. So you had the framework in place. Now you just needed the story, the match to light the powder keg, if it were. Where did you find what first tipped you off to the story of Henry Avery? Where did you first learn about this?
It was through some kind of internet search, because he shows up on a number of lists as a number of lists just organized by pure kind of monetary value of the largest heists in the history of crime, right? As I said, depending on how you value it, it's really unclear exactly how much it was worth, but somewhere in the $100 million range in today's currency. And so that there aren't a lot of, all the famous art heists and things like that. There aren't a lot of them that add up to $100 million. And so he was on there somewhere. And, it's just what you said when you were introducing it. I just said pirates, like to get to spend 2 or 3 years writing a book about pirates, how fun would that be? But it still wasn't enough, because, I wasn't interested in just writing a straight true crime story, as compelling as those can be. And so there's still this process of like, okay, it sounds interesting. It was definitely, I very quickly got to the idea that there was this global manhunt. And the idea that maybe this was the kind of predecessor of bin Laden, this idea of all the forces in the world trying to hunt one person in 1695. That right there, I was like, okay, that's powerful. That could be good. But it wasn't until I really began to see it as a story about the transition between these two regimes. And one thing I didn't mention that's so important here, if the British had been kicked out of India, that would have been an extraordinary event. It would have absolutely changed the course of history. I mean, what actually happened to Henry Avery is not, in the long run, so important, but he was right there at the center of this conflict. And if the East India Company had been technically like thrown out, it's entirely possible that the British Empire, as we know it, the way that it formed kind of in the next century and dominated India into the 1900s, into the 1800s, just that whole path might not have happened, because the East India Company basically had a monopoly on trade. And so they were kind of a corporation, but they also had state power behind them. And they slowly, the East India Company, as many people on the Zoom know, I'm sure, slowly morphed into a kind of occupying army that, in a sense, ultimately took possession of India. And that's how the British Empire kind of formed. It's this kind of evolution through the East India Company. But if you kick them out in 1695 and replace it with a bunch of competing firms, none of whom has an official sanctioned monopoly on trade, I don't think that subsequent history plays out in the same way. So it's a turning point, where change a few of the variables and the whole course of the next 2 centuries on a global scale really plays out very differently.
Yeah, it was funny you mentioned it, and somebody just typed in a question. I think you just answered so many questions. How much of a monopoly the East India Company have in India? Because I was going to ask you this tipping point. It's one of the great. As historians, we always try to deal with with what happened as opposed to what if. This is a great what if. Everything from Rudyard Kipling, Gandhi doesn't happen, or it doesn't necessarily happen in the way it does. So as you're researching this, and you made a point, it's not easy to track Henry Avery. You find out, how were you able to research this, and ultimately, when you're researching them, did you find out you liked him, you didn't like him, or what as a character? How did you resonate, and how did he resonate with you?
I think he probably was a unlikable person, but you can't spend that much time with an individual. I mean, the strange imaginative bond that an historian, an author forms with someone they're profiling who's been dead for centuries is a very powerful connection. Was living in my head for a long time. A very unlikely place. I'm sure he never imagined that, 300 years later, there'd be some guy in Brooklyn writing about him. But Avery himself, I try not to romanticize him, because that is what was done at the time. And I think that creating this mythology about a guy who was a criminal and whose men, at least, were clearly sexual predators on some level is wrong. But the pirates themselves, there are some very interesting things about the conventions on board pirate ships. And there's been some great arguments made that I draw upon in the book. There's a wonderful book called The Invisible Hook, as opposed to The Invisible Hand, that talks about the economic systems on board the pirate ships. And there's a very legitimate case to be made that the organizational form of the pirate ship was the most politically and economically progressive organizational system on the planet in 1700, say. And that the pirate ships had a very elaborate form of kind of profit sharing. They had basically high-low ratios, like, the captain would get this amount versus the lowest person. That was either 2-to-1 or 4-to-1, as opposed to a modern corporation where the ratio is 500-to-1. They had forms of insurance. If you lost a leg, you got more. If you lost an arm, you got more. They had an actual kind of representative democracy. You could vote the captain out. There was a kind of divided governance, and the quartermaster and the captain had different responsibilities. And so they were much more modern in terms of the way that they shared wealth and the way that they shared authority than a lot of the institutions on land at that point. And so what I tried to do is to say, on some level, these people are criminals. On some level, these people are sexual predators. On the other hand, they're struggling to invent a new way of organizing work and sharing wealth that would turn into more legitimate forms on land in the coming decades and centuries. But just like the East India Company was a glimpse of the future of a certain way of organizing work and wealth, the pirate ship was as well. And that's the thought that you have to kind of simultaneously keep in your head, is that they were rogues and criminals, but they were also the seedlings of something that maybe was a bit more positive.
How did word get back to London about Avery? You said about the troubadours.
Yeah.
How did news get back?
So it's one of the interesting things about the story, which is there are these lags, right? So the word went back via letters on ships. So it traveled at the speed of sail. There was no other, there were no telegrams, and obviously there was no internet. And so it takes a very long time and this is really crucial to the story, to the part of the story that I'm not totally revealing. It takes a long time for the news to get back to London that this terrible crime has happened, and that Aurangzeb is so angry and that he's imprisoned the people of the East India Company, and that gives Avery a huge head start. Basically, he's got months and months of time before, in a sense, he becomes the world's most wanted man. To try and evade authority. He still doesn't know. His problem is he doesn't know what people know. And so he has no way to check in to see if he's on the local news, right? So he's just at sea, hoping that, no one knows who he is. And so he has to figure out his strategies based on that lack of knowledge. But he does have a big lead because of how slow information is at that point. The one thing that I love, and I'm sure there's some sailors in this audience, there had been a report filed by an extended member of the East India Company who had seen Avery's men before the attack on the Gunsway. And they had been really impressed by and somewhat frightened by the speed of the Fancy, the boat, the ship in the water. And so they wrote a warning letter back to their colleagues saying, listen, there's this British pirate who goes by Every, and he's got this ship, the Fancy. And there's this great line in the letter. I actually used it as a chapter title, which is, I'm trying to remember the exact wording. I think it's, she referring to the ship, she sails so hard, or she sails so fast that she fears not who follows her. That she can just basically outrun everything in the water. And so I just always love that phrase. One of the chapters is called "She Fears Not Who Follows Her." So there was the sense that there was a potential problem brewing there, and there was an awareness that piracy was a problem, but it took a long time for the word to get back about this particular crime.
You kind of lead into this next question that you've got here. As such wanted people, these pirates must have found it very hard to spend all their booty. They must have had to stay away from civilization. Wonder where it all ended up, which is one of the great mysteries of piracy. But where did it all end up?
Well, apparently some of it ended up in Rhode Island. We see these Arabian coins that I learned from the guy who wrote me. So one of the first things that Avery does, this is another side of how the suspect ethics, although this was of course commonplace at the time, but when Avery first has pulled off the heist, and he's got all this conspicuous booty that's there in his little ship. I mean, it's just very obvious that he's stolen all this money. So he basically needs to launder it, right? He needs to figure out how to get rid of these Arabian coins that will mark him clearly as the guy who robbed the Gunsway. And so one of the first things that he does, which is just tragic to talk about it now, is that he trades a bunch of it for slaves. And he goes to Reunion off the island that's next to Madagascar, which was not called Reunion then. I can't remember what it was called. And a bunch of his men actually leave at that point. They're like, okay, we're fine. We've got our share and we're done. But a bunch of them stay. And he does this deal where basically he buys a bunch of slaves. And the idea is that the slaves are, once you have the wealth in the form of human capital, human property, it's not traceable back to Orangzeb. So he, on the one hand, it's very shrewd. On the other hand, it's terrifying and awful. But that was part of his strategy.
Remember, if you got any questions, to type them in. How long did it take you to research this? How long did you work on this?
The way that I tend to work is I always have a bunch of different things going at the same time that are just in different stages. Because one of the things that happens when you're a writer is there's just a lot of downtime in the life cycle of a book. So, once you finish your first draft and you send it to your editor, there's like a month before your editor writes back and there's really nothing for you to do. And then you turn back the edits. And then, there's often 5 or 6 months from when you basically finish the book before it actually comes out and so on. And so I always like to have projects in, kind of 3 or 4 projects in various stages of development, so that I can switch back and forth during those little fallow periods when the other project is not taking up a lot of time. And I find that that's actually really intellectually helpful as well, because there's often a lot of really fascinating cross-pollination that happens when you're working on one book but researching the other one. You're like actively writing one, but you're doing early research for the next book. And in the case of Enemy, the book I wrote before Enemy of All Mankind was a book called Farsighted, which was about decision-making and how we make complicated decisions. And it had a lot of stuff about actually novels. And when we read novels, we watch people making decisions on the kind of the inside, and we see, interesting narratives or about people making complicated choices. And so I've written all about this. And as I was writing Enemy, I thought, I realized I was almost unconsciously, because I just written Farsighted, as a narrative device, there are a number of different points where the story kind of just slows down, and I spend a page or two trying to tease through a complicated decision that one of the characters has to make, right? So, for instance, the decision, once every mutinies takes over what becomes the Fancy, the decision to go all the way around Africa, all the way to the Red Sea, when you could be in the Caribbean in 10 days. I spend a bunch of time kind of walking through what must have been, or potentially might have been, going through Avery's mind at that point. And I think those little moments, and there are a bunch of them in the book, I think they add to the drama and make it a little bit more novelistic in a way. And I completely wouldn't have written it that way had I not been writing this other book about decision-making. So there's a very long-winded way of saying that there's kind of a year of background research, of digging around, thinking maybe that this is the next book or a future book, and seeing what's there, and then consolidating that into a proposal, deciding that it is the next book, consolidating that in a proposal, and then a year of really doing hardcore research and writing a first draft, and then a year of editing and polishing and publishing. This is about a 3-year cycle.
All right. Well, speaking of your next book, that one sounds fascinating too. So I'd love to have you back to talk about that one too. If you're willing, if you're willing, I'm willing. So yeah. Thank you very much for doing this tonight. You know, you had me at hello with piracy. This has been great. So thank you very much for doing this. I'm glad you're able to do this from your house and not from a Holiday Inn. So good luck with this. Good luck with your next book. Thank you for spending the time with us. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Stay safe, everyone. Stephen, thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Hope you get a chance to read it. Bye, all.